All right. Good afternoon and welcome. This is a meeting of the Assembly Budget Subcommittee number 3 on Resources and Transportation. And we're holding this meeting jointly with Assembly Member Ricardo Lara, who is the chair of JLAC, and I want to welcome him to the hearing. Probably critical that that Assemblyman Lara be here, in that the audit that we're going to review today actually was initiated in his committee. It is an audit of the State Lands Commission, and the report from that audit was released this past August. The purpose of this hearing today is to get an explanation of the audit, and we'll hear from the Bureau of State Audits in that regard, and then to hear from the State Lands Commission on responses that they are taking to the audit. And specifically, part of the goal of this subcommittee is to understand fiscal implications related to this audit, both in terms of revenue and expenses. And so I welcome everyone. It is critically important that in this fiscal environment that the state manage well its resources. And I believe that this audit gives us an opportunity to examine our capacity and our ability to manage best our resources, and provides us with an opportunity to make sure that we're doing the best job possible. With that, let me welcome Chair Ricardo Lara from JLAC, and if you'd like to say a few words.
Thank you, Senator Gordon. It's really pleasure to be here today and have this, I think, very needed discussion of how we manage our state properties, and understanding that we know times are difficult and we keep on asking people to do more with less. But I think this is imperative, not only for our taxpayers, but for us as in terms of the legislature, ensuring that we are doing the best we can to ensure we guarantee revenue back to the state during this tough economic time. So I'm glad to be here, and I look forward to a fruitful discussion.
Great. Thank you very much. We're going to begin with a report from the Bureau of State Audits. And I'd like to invite forward Doug Cordner, the Chief Deputy State Auditor, to make this presentation. And Mr. Cordner, if you'd introduce the others who joined you at the table, please.
Surely.
And again, welcome.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Chair Gordon and Member Lara. To my left is Dee Vos. She's a Deputy State Auditor, and she was Project Manager on this particular audit. And further left, this is Kathleen, and she was the team leader, Kathleen Fullerton. She was a team leader on this particular audit. I'd like to begin by saying what I propose to do is step you through the audit report today, and then when it gets to the end, I'd like to defer to Dee and Kathleen to have them give a synopsis of the status of the recommendations we made based on the 60-day response from the State Lands Commission. By way of background, the State Lands Commission manages over 4,000 leases. 85 of them relate to oil and gas and are the primary revenue producers as far as their leases go. They have 900 agricultural, commercial, recreational, and about 3,200 leases that are rent-free, and they mainly have to do with recreational facilities. So the first part of the report dealt with what we believe were missed opportunities to generate more revenue. The first area that I'd like to discuss involves we found a number of delinquent leases In fact, we sampled 35 leases, and of those 35, 10 were delinquent between 5 and 22 years. We estimated that the lost revenue associated with those leases was $1.6 million. $1 million of that was penalties and interest, and $600,000 in principal. And that is reflected, if you have a copy of the report, it's reflected on Table 1 on page 17. And at various points in my presentation, I'll refer you to various tables to help aid in our discussion. An example of one of these delinquent leases was Crockett Marine Services, which hadn't paid rent since 1989, and the Commission had, in our view, taken little action on those past due amounts. In fact, when we brought this issue to their attention and discussed that lease, they determined that as of February, Crockett had sublet part of that property and was collecting rent on it itself. Since that point, I understand that the Commission has taken some steps to try to collect that delinquent amount beginning in April of 2011. One of the reasons why we feel that this was a problematic area was that the Commission doesn't have any policies to manage their delinquent leases. The Commission does not evict or pursue any remedy against lessees who do not pay their rent. The Commission believes that the reason why they don't take more forceful action is that evicting would be too costly to pursue, and while it may cost something to pursue an eviction, we didn't find that they did any cost benefit to support that belief. So that's one of our recommendations, that they do such a cost benefit. The next area I'd like to talk about is leases that have expired, and in the terminology that the State Lands Commission uses, that's deemed a holdover, a lease in holdover. When a lease is in holdover, until they renegotiate the terms of that lease going forward, what's supposed to happen is the lessee is supposed to pay the last agreed to annual rent until such time as that lease is renegotiated. As of December 2010, there were approximately 140 of the nearly 1,000 revenue-producing leases that had expired and were in holdover. The Commission lost revenue because it would have the Commission lost revenue it would have collected had it renegotiated those leases using a reappraised value. What we found was, in many instances, they hadn't done any appraisal in a significant number of years, missing opportunities to increase the amount of annual rents. One of the examples we cite in the report is New Star Energy's annual rental amount was $29,333, which we adjusted for just simple CPI, and that boosted the annual amount to $32,854. But by way of giving you an example of what a reappraisal could benefit the State Lands Commission, they in 2010 they determined through an appraisal that they should increase the rental amount, and they did that as of June 2011 to $168,285 a year. So using that amount, we estimated that while it was in holdover, the Commission lost out on $672,000 it could have collected. The Commission seldom, if ever, enforces a provision in its lease that it's had in those leases since 1990 that allows it to charge a 25% penalty until such time, along with the as I said before, until they renegotiate a lease, they pay what the last negotiated annual amount was. But this provision allows them to charge a 25% penalty on top of that, but they've not really used that provision. And they told us that the reason why they don't is they feel it would hinder negotiations with the lessee. But again, if you've never tried to use that provision, it's hard to really say what the lessee would or wouldn't do. And the next area that we found where they lost out on some revenue was they don't always promptly conduct rent reviews. In the lease, most of the leases that are on record provide every 5 years, it allows the commission to go in and through appraisal or other means determine whether that property should be increased, that annual rent should be increased or should remain as it was. Normally, through the passage of time, even through the consumer price index, it would go up some, and that is one means they can use. But what we found is that frequently they didn't reappraise when they could have, and through neglecting to do so, they lost out on the ability to increase those annual rents. And in fact, they failed to promptly perform rent reviews on 18 of the 35 leases that we looked at. For those 18 leases, if they had conducted the rent reviews when they could have collected an additional $6.3 million, and that is reflected on Table 3 on page 24. The lease provisions also allow the commission, they require the commission in anticipating of adjusting an annual rent there to notify the lessee 30 days in advance of that change that they are going to increase the rent. We also looked for that feature to see if they complied with that requirement. And what we found was in 15 leases that we looked at, on 22 occasions, they failed to notify the lessee in time to increase the rent. Now, when they miss that date, if they don't notify them 30 days in advance, they have to wait another year before they can go in and adjust that rent. So that's a costly omission. We also found that, as I said earlier, that the failure to appraise the commission's properties regularly may cause them to be undervalued. They can, like I said, every 5 years they can reappraise, but of the 35 leases we looked at, they'd only, on average, been reappraised 3 times over the period of the lease. And expressed in another way, of the 35 leases we looked at, 10 had not been reappraised in over 15 years. So using the 5-year benchmark, they could have reappraised that property 3 times in that amount of time, and they didn't. Some appraisals result in a significant increase in rent. For example, the commission conducted an appraisal of a Chevron lease, and it resulted in an increase in annual rent from $319,000 to $1.3 million. So when you don't do those appraisals, it can be a costly a thing. We also found that the commission is undervaluing certain types of leases, namely it has certain formula that it uses for its pipelines, and we found that that formula hadn't been updated in 30 years. Therefore, it was averaging about 50 cents per linear foot. We looked at 3 other states who were doing a similar kind of a formula base, and we found that they were using 190 a linear foot. So again, they're losing out by not updating that formula to more current value. The commission also uses benchmarks. A benchmark is when an appraiser goes out and does an appraisal in a certain region for like type properties in that region. we found that the Commission uses 11 benchmarks, and we found 4 that hadn't been updated since 1992. And those were for San Francisco Bay Area, Sonoma, Marin, and the Black Point in Marin. Again, increasing or more frequently doing those appraisals would increase the amount of revenue garnered by the Commission. We also had problems. As I said earlier, we did a selection of 35 cases leases that we reviewed. We would have liked to have used the Commission's database, that contains data on the leases, but we found it to be unreliable, and therefore we had to go to the files instead. What we found when we looked at that database system, it's called the Application Lease Information Database, that the Commission wasn't appropriately tracking the status of many of its leases. We found incorrect rental amounts, incorrect lease expiration dates, and blank or incorrect tickler files for when Commission staff was supposed to do certain things associated with those leases. 3 divisions play a role in utilizing that particular database, but instead of using the centralized database, they've all developed spreadsheets, electronic spreadsheets, that they individually use, but they never compare the data from one spreadsheet to the other to see if they reconcile or are consistent in the centralized database. The next area I'm going to talk about is more about oversight. The division doesn't, or the Commission doesn't regularly audit its revenue generating leases, nor does it adequately oversee granted lands. Granted lands, the legislature can act to grant some of these public lands to a local entity, but that doesn't relinquish their responsibility to oversee, to see that all terms and conditions are complied with by that granted entity. What we found was they haven't developed a plan for monitoring the nearly 1,000 revenue-generating leases, and particularly those 85 I mentioned earlier that are for the extraction of gas, oil, or minerals, which is their main revenue producer. In fact, in 2010 and 11, $400 million was generated through those 85 mineral and oil extracted leases. So it's a real heavy generator of revenue. The Commission reported that it recovered and saved nearly $22 million through audits of those kinds of leases between 2004 and 2007. However, since 2008, it's only conducted 2 audits, and neither one of them were of these high generating revenue producers. That we found to be of concern. Because of the insufficient number, the reason why that they said they haven't done this is they cited an insufficient number of staff to conduct these monitoring activities, and they only react to problems when they're discovered. They are not proactive in going out, setting an audit schedule. Perhaps, as we suggest in the report, we understand that their resources are limited, but you can still do a risk-based approach, and therefore you could look at your highest revenue producers, audit those, the ones that have exhibited the most problems in the past, audit those, and the rest could be of a lower priority, but still to have no audits done was problematic in our view. The Commission hasn't developed an audit plan or designated a plan designated to ensure that the revenues generated by granted lands are used properly. According to the Commission, again, the staffing constrains its ability to do those kinds of activities. Also, as I said, they neither have a plan nor do they have a monitoring schedule with which to audit its revenue-producing leases. Another area that we found problems in was that they don't always ensure that lessees have current surety bonds or liability insurance. In fact, of the 35 leases we looked at, we found that 21 either didn't have a surety bond, didn't have liability insurance, or had neither. That's of a concern, because if there's an accident or if there's a property damage that occurs on any of those leased lands, the state's vulnerable. They have no recourse. The last chapter we dealt with was, we heard frequently, while we weren't specifically asked in the audit to look at staffing, we heard that as so frequently as the reason why certain activities weren't carried out, that we wanted to look a bit at the staffing. And what we found was, if you'll turn to figures 2 and 3 on pages 50 and 51, that the Commission has sustained a loss of staff over the last, since basically from 1990 to 2010, there's been a decline from 253 total staff to 210. And on its face, that might not look that significant, but if you look at those two charts, you'll see that a lot of that is concentrated. The loss of staff is concentrated in two of the areas that are responsible for those revenue-producing leases. They're land management and the mineral divisions. They sustained a higher percentage of loss to their staff, because those are both generally funded areas of responsibility, whereas there's other responsibilities within the Commission that is paid for with other funding sources, as that first figure demonstrates. But what we didn't see was, while they've asked for augmentations to their staffing over the years, many times they hadn't been successful in doing that. But in looking at their BCPs and other documents asking for staff, we didn't see any real justification where they could have maybe done a better job of marketing their need in terms of, as I mentioned earlier, in their audits area, the oversight. If they in fact did save $22 million over 3 years, they could equate that and say, for every additional position, we're going to bring back many times that in savings or increased revenue, if that were the case. So we thought that that's an area that if they were to do that, they would be probably more successful in convincing decision makers that there truly is a need and where that need resides. Lastly, we looked at succession planning. Many of the staff of the divisions that, again, are responsible for the revenue generating leases are above 55 and or are retiring within the next 5 to 6 years, but the Commission has no real plan to replace them. In fact, they have several retired annuitants that they're relying on, but retired annuitants, as you may know, can only work part-time. So there's a real need to be addressing that in the future. With that, I will defer to my two colleagues to discuss the status of the recommendations we made.
Good afternoon. My name is Dee Vos, and as Doug mentioned, I was the project manager on this audit. And what I'm going to do is provide you a brief summary of our assessment of the Commission's 60-day response to our report's recommendations. Before I start, though, I want to make it really clear that as it relates to any agency that provides its progress in implementing our recommendations at 60 days, typically we do not expect significant progress. On the other hand, when an agency submits their 6 months report, we do expect to see that many of our recommendations have been addressed. So keeping that in mind. So with that, Kathleen and I performed our initial analysis of the Commission's 60-day response, which included a discussion of how the Commission has addressed or plans to address each of our individual recommendations, as well as they also provided some of the related documentation to support their discussion. And we went ahead and summarized the Commission's progress in implementing a total of 27 recommendations in our report under 4 really broad categories. But before I provide that summary, again, I need to emphasize that our assessment of the Commission's progress in implementing our recommendations is based solely on what they've included or told us in their 60-day response and some documentation that they were able to provide us, not on any actual audit work we performed to verify their response at this point. So what we found, or what we have done, is we categorized them under 4 categories, and we found that, or we believe that, the Commission has fully implemented 6 of our recommendations at this point. They've partially implemented 9 of our recommendations. They have 9 recommendations that we consider are pending, and then there are 3 where we characterize them as no action taken. Okay? So what I thought I would do is, I don't want to go through all 27 recommendations. I'm going to select one from each category and briefly tell you what we found and why we came to the conclusion we came to. So as an example of a recommendation that we believe, based on the Commission's response, is fully implemented, relates to one where we recommended that the Commission continue to implement its newly established holdover reduction procedures and periodically evaluate whether its new procedures are having their intended effect of reducing the number of leases in holdover. According to their 60-day response, the Commission believes that its new holdover reduction procedures have been effective, with the result that the number of leases in holdover has decreased by 75%. So, and as I already mentioned, I'm basing our assessment on what the Commission told us, not on us doing any audit work out at the Commission to see that that in fact is true at this point. The second category where they have recommendations that we believe are only partially implemented. To provide an example of one, our recommendation that in order to complete its rent reviews promptly and obtain a fair rental amount for its leases, the Commission should establish time standards for each step of the rent review process, ensure that all staff adhere to those time standards. We assess the Commission's progress in implementing this recommendation as only partially implemented because although the Commission provided us with its rent review policies and procedures in its 60-day response, these procedures did not specifically include time standards for each step in the rent review process, including appraisals. So we're hoping to see that in the next, at the 6-month response. As an example of a recommendation that we believe is pending, it relates to a recommendation that when the Commission determines it will pursue delinquent lessees itself, the Commission should use a collection agency or a program such as the Franchise Tax Board's Interagency Intercept Collections Program. In the 60-day response, the Commission indicated that that it is conducting an analysis to determine if it is currently authorized to use a collection agency or if it can participate in the FTB's Intercept program. And so since it's simply at the, starting its analysis, we felt this one should be classified as pending. And then as an example of where we believe the Commission has not really taken any action yet at this time, relates to a recommendation that we had that states, in order to complete its rent reviews promptly and to obtain a fair rental amount for its leases, the Commission should develop a methodology for prioritizing its workload that focuses its staff on managing the higher revenue generating leases until such a time that it addresses its workload needs. We found that although the Commission provided policies and procedures that instructed staff to focus on significant leases, those greater than $10,000, to reduce the number of leases in holdover, in its 60-day response, it really didn't provide us with any kind of similar methodology for prioritizing its leases needing rent reviews. So we expect that hopefully they will have that in their 6-month response. So at this point,
Well, welcome.
are there any questions?
Any questions?
Thank you. I have one question, and then others may also have questions. One of the things that I'm trying to get my hands around is the process within the agency, within the Commission. Is it you talk about that it appears that there's some level of lack of coordination between the various divisions, accounting, land management, and legal, as it would relate to things, and that they've been using separate spreadsheets to track things. To what extent did you see that perhaps this kind of lack of communication between these divisions had some impact on the fact that leases weren't current, rents weren't being collected?
Well, I won't speak to the specifics, but I know in one instance we found one lease that they weren't aware they had and hadn't been aware of it for, 12 years?
Yeah. Is this on?
Yeah.
Kathleen Fullerton, good afternoon. The one example that I can think of where we discussed in the report regarding the disparate lists had to do with the leases that were delinquent, and we found that each, like you said, each one of the various divisions was tracking those separately, and we had a concern because one of them, which the Crockett lease, was considered a contingent lease, which means it has some legal dispute associated with it. However, we found it wasn't on the legal division's workload list. So we felt that this lack of coordination really contributed to some of these leases perhaps staying delinquent for a significant period of time, whereas if they had coordinated, they might have addressed them sooner.
Thank you. Other questions?
Thank you. You briefly mentioned about the staffing issue and how the Commission keeps referring to that. So in the span of 20 years, we've seen a decline in the staffing. But is that a legitimate concern in terms of some of those leases that were, never looked at 20 years ago?
Well, there was full staffing, as you said, 20 years ago. So if things have gone on as long as they have, it indicates that even when fully staffed, they weren't doing some of the activities that one would think they would be doing in order to maximize the revenues from those leased properties.
If there's no further questions, let me thank you and for your presentation, and I'll invite representatives from the State Lands Commission to come forward and take the witness table, and we will be hearing from the Commission on response to the audit and to comments that have just been made.
Let me get these things distributed.
Okay. And we have David Brown, Chief of Administration and Information Services Division. And is Mr. Brown going to take the lead on this?
Actually, I'm going to take the lead.
Okay. And you are Jennifer Lucchese, I would guess.
Yes.
Okay.
Good afternoon.
And Jennifer, would you then introduce the rest of the folks who are with you?
Of course. My name is Jennifer Lucchesi. I'm the Chief Counsel for the State Lands Commission. With me, I have Dave Brown, our Chief of Administrative and Information Services. To my left is Greg Scott, our Chief of Mineral Resources and Management Division. And to my further left is Brian Bush, our Chief of our Land Management Division. I will begin with a brief introduction of the Commission's jurisdiction and responsibilities and some brief remarks on the audit. Dave will then discuss our action plan developed in response to the audit report's findings. Dave's discussion will focus on the severe erosion of staffing resources suffered by the Commission and the reactive mode current staff operates in because of our staffing limitations. It is staff's belief that if given the adequate resources, opportunities for increasing revenues can be pursued and seized more quickly and efficiently. If time allows, Greg will be providing examples through a summary of staff's proven record of successes and potential opportunities for increased revenue generation if the Commission is given the resources to pursue such opportunities. The Commission and its staff strive to balance the goals of maximizing the return on the use of state lands and resources entrusted to our care with providing the highest possible level of environmental and resource enhancement and protection of these lands for current and future generations. This is a dual responsibility that must be balanced in every lease and project analyzed by staff and considered by the Commission. Revenue generation on one hand and protection and enhancement of our lands and resources for current and future generations on the other. The Commission is primarily a land and resource management agency. It's not a regulatory agency. Currently, with 10 land agents, 8 surveyors, and 1 appraisal staff, the Commission manages approximately 4 million acres of public trust lands, including 120 rivers, 40 lakes, and lands along 1,000 miles of coastline out 3 miles into the Pacific Ocean. With only 1 land agent, the Commission manages approximately 489,000 acres of school lands. With only 1 agent, a different one, the Commission oversees the management of 85 grants of state lands pursuant to over 300 statutes. With only 4 petroleum engineers and 3 auditors, the Commission manages approximately 67 oil and gas leases and contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars. The audit conducted by BSA by the Bureau of State Audits found that the Commission had lost approximately $8.2 million over the past 20 years. During that same 20-year period, the Commission generated over $3.8 billion for the general fund and STRS. With that said, BSA's report provided constructive criticism of Commission staff's practices and procedures. Were there failures identified concerning specific leases? Yes. However, those failures were primarily contained to certain geographical areas and a select few land agents. Staff is currently pursuing remedies for these failures, including litigation. The failures associated with communication, coordination, process, and procedures have been or are currently being remedied in accordance with the report's recommendations as appropriate. For the remaining recommendations, most of these are practical and achievable if the Commission is provided the opportunity to acquire and retain adequate staffing to address these areas. With that, I invite Dave to continue our presentation with a discussion of our action plan as recently presented to our Commission.
Thank you, Jennifer. My name again is Dave Brown, and I am the Chief Administrative Officer for the Commission. The Commission directed staff at its September 1st meeting to prepare a plan to address the findings by the Bureau regarding the Commission's management of leases of state property. Their report describes areas where auditors noted a failure of staff to perform certain duties or to pursue certain debts or leases. Staff has reviewed the findings and found most to be reasonably accurate, if not somewhat sensationalized and without perspective of the Commission's overall responsibilities and accomplishments. Many of the findings revealed process breakdowns or an inability to maintain certain responsibilities due to staffing limitations, principally in general fund positions. The Commission's general fund supported positions have been eroding over the past 20 years. And I've given you a chart there, the first graph of which shows the general fund positions, the blue graph. In 1990, the Commission had 242 positions supported by the general fund. The current budget has only 62. This is a 74% reduction over that period. General fund positions are those to perform lease compliance and trespass enforcement, appraisals and rent reviews, oil and gas reservoir analysis and production engineering, royalty accounting and financial auditing, hazard removal and litigation support. They are also responsible for much of the Granted Lands Trust management program. All these activities are vital to the effective management of public trust assets entrusted to the Commission's care, and not coincidentally, those activities for which the Commission is now being criticized for not performing effectively. Nonetheless, over the same period of time, through careful prioritization of activities to maintain its income stream, the Commission has continued to earn non-tax revenues of over $3.8 billion. But in spite of this record of revenue income, the Commission has never been considered a revenue-producing agency for purposes of being exempted from across-the-board cuts. The general fund portion of the Commission's budget has been suffering from a death by 1,000 cuts, none of which would be fatal, but over time have been debilitative to many of these public trust activities. The Commission has received additional positions from other funding sources for regulatory programs regarding oil spill prevention and marine invasive species programs, and has also relied much more heavily on reimbursements from project applicants to cover staffing costs. Commission staff still numbers over 200. That would be the next slide in your package. But because of the limitations dictated by these funding sources, these other positions must be devoted only to those programs and are not available to address the issues pointed out in the Bureau's report. The Bureau acknowledged the staffing issue in Chapter 3 of the report, and I quote, "Significant reductions in staff have hindered the Commission's ability to conduct activities necessary to ensure that the state receives appropriate revenues and that lessees comply with lease terms. Repeated requests to prior administrations for staffing have gone unheeded. Several past budget requests have been submitted directly, addressing those deficiencies that have now been identified in the Bureau's audit findings. The Commission staff also identified this loss of staffing as a major risk factor in its 2009 Biennial Fiscal Integrity State Managers Accountability Act report, or FSMA, in regards to both the erosion of general fund positions and the depletion of the audit program. The Bureau's report makes several recommendations for correcting deficiencies noted and improving processes and procedures. However, such procedural and process improvements alone can only impact deficiencies noted to the extent that adequate staff resources are available to implement and carry out the work. The simple fact is that the program cannot sustain reductions on the scale experienced by the Commission with the expectation there will be no adverse impact on the activities necessary to carry out those program responsibilities. As such, as a first priority in response to the audit, staff has prepared and forwarded requests for additional staffing for consideration. These requests reflect the most urgent needs to address the areas of auditing and royalty accounting, lease compliance and revenue enhancement to perform rent reviews, pursue delinquent and non-compliant lessees, and prosecute trespassers, and title and trust compliance for oversight of the 85 grants to local governments that include all the major ports and urban waterfronts. These requests represent the most urgent staffing needs necessary to immediately address those areas deficient in resources to sustain effective program levels as delineated in the Bureau's report. Staff also recognizes the need to effectively quantify its overall staffing needs and will continue to analyze workload and program outputs and results as suggested in the report in preparing future augmentations. Now, the report did identify 6 major areas of concern, and they've already gone over these somewhat. Delinquent leases and general lease compliance, holdovers, missed rent reviews, audit cycles for the leases, statutory trust grant oversight, and the lease database. The details of the staff's action plan are in your handout from your staff, and unless there is a desire to, I was not going to go through that again. Okay? And as expressed in response to the Bureau's report, Commission staff...
Let me just say,
yes.
There were, perhaps what you might do, though,
yes.
There were 3, we just heard from the Audit Bureau, there were 3 items where you've taken no action as of the 60-day report. So perhaps you could let us know whether you've done anything on those three.
Three items.
We that was the first, when you heard it, that's what we heard in terms of
we haven't
that
received any
categorization.
feedback
That was the first time we've heard that.
Okay.
So I don't know which ones those are, but we could, given that information.
Okay, let me, I think, Ms. Voss, could you come forward and just identify what those three recommendations that you had categorized as not yet being addressed? Yeah, you can come up to this microphone up here. And then you can
prioritize workload for rent
Just-
reviews.
The first one I already mentioned.
Yes, got
The
that.
second one is to adequately monitor its revenue-generating oil and gas leases, the Commission should work with lessees that entered into a lease with the Commission before 1977 to put in place a reasonable time period within which lessees must resolve other types of deduction claims similar to the regulations already in place for dehydration costs. And what we, how we assessed the Commission's action, they had indicated that there are arguments that promulgating lease regulations that may alter the terms of an existing valid contract may not be legally enforceable. Additionally, the Commission refers to a change in regulations but does not specifically comment on whether it is attempting to amend the regulations. Our problem with this one is we believe either the Commission is misinterpreting our recommendation. We did not recommend that the Commission adopt new regulations. We're simply recommending that the Commission try to work with the lessees to obtain, their mutual consent as to a reasonable time period to resolve these claims. Okay?
all right, and then there was a third one.
Yeah, the third one is related to succession planning, where we said, to better address current and potential future staffing shortages as well as the impending loss of institutional knowledge, the Commission should create a succession plan. And basically, they told us that they agree with it, but that they don't have the staff to do it. So.
Okay, thank you. And Mr. Brown, I understand that you've just heard this, and if you don't have a full response, that's fine. We could get something later, but I don't want to. I'm not trying to do a gotcha here or anything.
That's
just.
Could you answer the rent review issue?
Yeah, I'd need a little clarification on the first one again, exactly what, if you can explain again the
Prioritizing workload for rent reviews, putting time periods in for the rent review. And I thought those were in the new checklists and so on.
Yeah, we did provide them. Maybe I can answer this. We did provide them with a bunch of background attachments that explained what our rent review checklist was and the prioritization of how we're doing it. I'm not exactly sure. You said that we've done it for the holdover aspect of it, but not for the rent reviews.
You developed a methodology to prioritize your workload where you're focusing on those greater than $10,000 for your
right,
holdovers.
Or significant leases, yes.
Yeah, but we didn't
So you're
see any
satisfied with
evidence in what you provided us that you're doing the same thing for your higher revenue generating leases that, for your rent reviews as opposed to your holdovers.
Right, and some of those holdovers we've done rent reviews, the more significant ones, those are reflected for some that you mentioned, the New Star, the two Tesoros. A lot of those have been taken to Commission, and the rents are up to date, even though they're still in holdover status.
So it's just
in
that
essence,
we're not
that's giving
seeing-
some prioritization of we're prioritizing those, and we're making sure there's done the PAPCO, the PANGL ones that were also on the holdover list that have subsequently been taken off, had rent reviews done, and then taken to Commission for renewal of the lease. So.
But we're focusing on the rent reviews on this
Right.
one. So
Right.
that's-
Okay.
So.
I was just going to move on to the second
Yeah, please.
recommendation in her third list. I think we must have misinterpreted what their recommendation was. When I read it, they're asking us to develop and implement regulations that would apply to any new lease by putting in place a reasonable time period with which lessees must resolve other types of deduction claims. When we hear new lease, we think of a new lease, not necessarily amending a current lease that we have with a lessee. And so we will go back with more insight as to what they were actually requesting and look into that.
And regarding the succession planning, no, we haven't started on that. And frankly, we keep reeling from the various cuts that we have to sustain. In order to put a succession plan in place, you have to have the flexibility to actually fill positions. And we haven't seen that over the course of the past year or so. So it is something that we agree with, needs to be done, but it's very difficult in the current environments.
Okay, thank you. I interrupted you to ask you to comment on, because we'd agreed that you weren't going to discuss all of the steps in response. I did ask you to respond to 3, and you've done that.
Okay.
So my interruption is concluded, and we'll let you continue.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, the only thing we wanted to add was, as expressed in the response to the Bureau's report, the Commission staff does appreciate the recommendations detailed. Most of the recommendations are practical and achievable if the Commission is provided with the opportunity to acquire and retain adequate staff. Even in the face of the continual staff reductions, Commission staff continues to seek opportunities to generate revenue for the state for private or commercial use of state property. For example, this past legislative session, we were very successful, given our resources, to get a couple of bills passed, assist in getting those passed, one of which was SB 152 by Pavley, which will bring all the recreational piers heretofore that were rent-free into rent-paying status. That will essentially double the number of revenue-producing leases that we have, and will result in at least another $2.5 million a year at the end of a 10-year cycle. And then another bill by Assemblywoman Skinner for the Renewable Energy Program. We're able to get some positions there that could result in $11 million in annual revenues to the state teachers retirement system through alternative energy sites by consolidating our lands and doing exchanges with BLM. And we believe that there are other opportunities for additional revenues well beyond those identified in the report. And now, if time will allow, I'd like to turn it over to Greg Scott, our chief of our Minerals Management Division. As was stated earlier, the real money is in the oil and gas. And I'd like him to discuss some of our past successes and potential opportunities there.
All right, Mr. Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Good afternoon, Mr. Chair. Is this on? Can you hear me okay? My name is Greg Scott. I'm the Chief of the State Lands Commission's.
You could bring it a little bit closer, please.
All right.
It is on. You just need a little closer.
All right, is that better? I'm the Chief of the State Lands Commission's Mineral Resources Management Division. I would like to address the resource revenue generation efforts of the State Lands Commission staff and emphasize the successes the Commission staff has been involved in during the recent past, as well as mention our present and potential opportunities. The Commission has relied heavily on its resource mineral staff to cause maximum royalty revenues from its lands through its mineral leasing activity, particularly where oil, gas, solid minerals, and geothermal resources are abundant. The fact sheet that you have before you highlights only some of the many projects that the staff has been involved with to generate considerable royalty revenues for the state. 3 of these projects shown as past successes in the fact sheet account for over $2 billion in state revenues since 1992. 2 projects of particular note are the Huntington Beach Field and the Belmont Field projects in offshore Southern California, where innovative royalty and leasing concepts by state land staff have enabled optimal resource recovery and significant revenue generation over and above that which we would have received otherwise. These projects, as well as others during that time, however, were accomplished with significantly greater staff resources than are presently available. The work performed by staff then are causing significant revenues to continue to occur at the present time. Current projects staff are working on, and some of those are also shown on the fact sheet, are capable of considerable additional resources to the state. But the limited number of technical staff at the present time will limit the attention necessary to pursue these projects to their greatest benefit, and will also prolong the ability to get these projects generating state revenues in a timely manner. The state has considerable untapped mineral resources, both offshore and onshore, and if and when those resources become of interest for development, it will be imperative for the State Lands Commission to have the necessary staff resources to evaluate their development adequately. Resource commodity prices have created good economic times for the state to invest in technical staff to optimize the revenues from state mineral resources. In addition to the royalty revenue generation, the Commission conducts financial audits of the properties that currently generate state royalties to assure that the state is receiving full value from the resources extracted and sold. Audit staff positions are low, only 3 auditors now compared to 7 in the early 1990s. But the value of our audits is significant, as is shown on the fact sheet, where with only 3 staff, audit recoveries or savings have exceeded $3 million per year since 2004. In conclusion, then, the State Lands Commission has a long record of revenue generation for the state, and this record can continue at its high level, provided that adequate numbers of technical staff can be achieved. Thank you.
And if I may add to that, there was one statement made by the Bureau concerning our not asking for positions. Back in 2006-07, we received a limited-term audit position for 2 years. With that limited-term audit position, we were able to show a return on investment of $1.2 million annually. We did a supplemental report to the legislature illustrating this with workload and everything else. Subsequent budget requests were denied. Don't ask me why, but that, we have made significant efforts to try to get additional staffing, and it has really fallen on deaf ears. In the case of a lot of what the minerals people do, there's no guarantee that we can increase revenues next year or the year that the position is created in order to cover the cost of that position. And those have been the ground rules for several years. However, if we don't make the investment now, there's a 5 to 7 year lead time in putting together some of these projects before you're going to see any revenue. And if we do not make that investment, then these revenues are going to be either left in the ground or wasted.
That concludes our presentation, and we're happy to answer questions.
Sure. Let me start. I have several questions for you. I guess foremost for me, I'm concerned in particular about the issue of coordination. Based on a question I asked of the auditors, and I'm wondering. I come from the Silicon Valley, and most of our corporations have found that they can work very well if they create teams, multidisciplinary teams. And I'm wondering whether you've ever given consideration to putting together a team that would include folks from accounting, land management, and legal, and giving them a set of leases to oversee, so that there is no possibility of not coordinating because it's all within one unit. And I'm wondering if there's ever been any consideration to that as an organizational structure.
Currently, we are set up partially like that. Between our land management division and our legal division, we are organized geographically into teams as well as subject matter in teams that way. We have not taken that next step further to include our accounting division into that team structure, but we'll take that back to our office and think about that. That may be a good idea. In addition, in terms of communication and coordination, we have set up a process, and the documentation is not actually before you, because although it was provided to the Bureau of State Audits, because it is confidential document, but it sets up a procedure and coordination between our accounting division, our legal division, and our land management division to meet on a regular basis to prioritize those delinquent leases and prioritize those trespassers into how we approach those and pursue remedies against those trespassers or delinquent leases. So from that perspective, we hasn't been done as far as we're concerned, that type of coordination and communication, and frankly, I think we're very excited to get that going because it's desperately needed.
Okay. One of the comments made in the audit had to do with the holdover leases and the fact that most of your leases have a clause that would allow for a 25% essentially surcharge when the lease has not been renegotiated. It was characterized that the Commission was not interested in that because you thought it would hinder negotiations. I find that kind of counterintuitive. Certainly, unless my rent is likely to increase by over 25%, having a 25% surcharge would certainly make me want to get to the table and get a lease resolved. So can you explain why you think that hinders negotiations?
In some cases it does, in other cases it doesn't. We have worked that out, and we're starting to utilize that as a tool. We haven't had that occasion yet, but we've structured that into our holdover reduction procedures, which the Bureau of State Audit said was an item that we've completed. So we will have the opportunity to use that as a tool going forward a little bit better. But in some cases, the amount of the rent that would increase is actually more than the 25%, so we may want to opt to hold that back. And another situation is, in some of these leases, we're getting much of that back rent. It was mentioned in a few of these cases and in some of these tables that it's lost revenue. There's a couple examples. You'll see one buried in a footnote where we got, for a shell lease, is one of the $6.2 million on table 3. $2.5 million of that we recovered prior to this audit being completed, and they were aware of that, and they put that in a footnote. So that wasn't really lost revenue. We actually gained that back, so we got all of that money back. And we use that in a balancing to kind of push this along. There are definitely occasions where we would want to use the 25%, and we will be using that 25%. And now we are structured through our holdover procedure in our notification process to those lessees ahead of that time, where we don't have any legal vagaries to be able to implement that holdover procedure. So I think we'll be using that much more often going forward.
Also, I understand that from comments that were made that prior to this audit that you really didn't have a policy to manage delinquent leases. Can you tell me where you are on relative to such a policy today?
Oh, yeah. I think what I understand you to say is that once we are made aware of a delinquent lease, pursuing that to either get them to start paying or pursue legal action. And I mentioned previously that we have set up a process where there's much more communication and coordination on a regular basis between our land management division, legal, and accounting to review those delinquent leases, prioritize those, and also do that cost-benefit analysis that also includes policy considerations into determining how and at what speed and to what extent to pursue that delinquent lease. We have leases that range, for $100 a year to hundreds of thousands of dollars a year. And so there does need to be some prioritization. We can't go after everybody. So this team that we will be meeting regularly with has that charge to prioritize and to do that kind of cost-benefit analysis, both economically as well as policy considerations to pursue those delinquent leases.
And I guess finally, perhaps more of a comment. As the chair of the budget subcommittee that will be reviewing any budget change proposals submitted by the administration relative to staffing for the commission, one thing that is not completely clear to me is the fact that some of these issues and problems date back to times prior to the reductions that you have had and were ongoing for a long period of time. I'm, for one, if we get such budget change proposals, I'm going to be very interested in a really solid workload analysis, and I'm going to want to understand, really what workload someone is carrying. How the some 4,000 leases that you oversee are being managed, and to better understand why, what additional staff are necessary in order to manage. And I'm also would be interested in an analysis or projection clearly of if there were positions to be added. What's the revenue increase that we can see? And at some point, there's a diminishing return on the number of staff added in terms of the amount of revenue. So that's part of why I'm very curious about a workload study. And it may be that if you need some help from the legislature in terms of like the legislative analyst office or others to help take a look at that workload issue and provide some information to us should we be seeing a budget change proposal, I'll be happy to help with that. But I'm going to really need to clearly understand if there is a budget change proposal, what we're really getting for any additional staff we add. When it seems to me that an awful lot of this also relates just to some general lack of coordination, lack of policies and procedures internally that that don't rely on just additional staff. Let me see if my colleagues have comments or questions.
Thank you. Yeah, I have a comment. At this point, I don't see the value of just putting more staff without really fixing, I think, the management issues that are going on here that you talked about. I think the other part of it is, Chairman, I think we really need to, and not that I'm telling you what to do, but the succession plan, I think, is something that's very vital. And if, they don't have the staff to do it, we have to make sure somebody gets that done. And I think we can make that happen through your budget subcommittee and ensuring that that gets done if we're going to, provide future funding for this commission, because I think it's a vital part. I'm not on sub 3, but I can tell you that I'm at a point I'm not comfortable right now, approving any budgets for future staff augmentation without really addressing the management issues that are going on here. And I understand that we've cut staff, but all of us have been tasked to do, more with less. And the fact is that all of it is real money, no matter how small amount. When we're cutting and devastating our public schools, that's real money too. And so we need to do our best that what we can with the resources we have to ensure that we bring in as much money that we can. And so, those are just some thoughts. I really think, Chairman, we really need to look at that succession plan and ensure that it's part of the mandate in terms of our budget. So,
thank you for the comment. Appreciate it. Mr. Jones, any comments? We're going to take some public. I don't know. Let me ask. We had also listed here in response to the audit Alan Gordon from the State Controller's Office. Mr. Gordon, would you like to make some comments? Okay. So let me then thank Jennifer Lucchese and the folks from the State Lands Commission. And if you would please extend to Mr. Fossum, the executive officer, my regrets that he couldn't be here today.
Mr. Chairman, Alan Gordon, Deputy Controller, Environmental Policy. I started this job about 6 months ago, and one of the first things that came to us is a lot of issues having to do with state lands. The audit was coming forward. Few kind of general comments, and then I'll get down to specifics. First of all, I understand the difficult job you have, as Mr. Lara just pointed out. We're cutting across state government. We're way past cutting, fat. We're cutting down to bone, and we're taking dental care from old people and preschool care for preschool for farm workers' children, and none of this is fun. Spent 20 years in the other house. It's a lot easier when you guys have money to give out than doing the job you're doing right now. That said, one of the things that's interesting is when you look at the audit and kind of the grand scheme, it's that they're not generating the revenue that they could generate, which is probably accurate. Second, but that said, they're not designated by Department of Finance and the legislature as a revenue generating agency. So that they've added staff in specific things such as oil spills, while losing the general funded staff in a way that is clearly penny wise and pound foolish. No, I don't disagree with you. There are serious management issues. There are control issues that need to be taken care of. The fact that this has been going on since the Wilson administration. I mean, we've watched Governor Wilson cut the staff significantly. It went up slightly under Governor Davis. Then Governor Schwarzenegger took a meat axe to them again. Had they been designated as a revenue-generating agency, I think it would have been done differently. These leases are an opportunity to generate revenue. So if there's anything that I would say that you folks might want to think about this year, would be changing that designation so that they are a revenue-generating agency, which would then allow a follow-up.
That's Mr. Gordon's first bill.
They would allow a follow-up at that point in time, which would then force them to look at positions that could generate and to justify the positions that would generate the most revenue. Let me give you a classic example of where we are right now in kind of getting something done there. When I first came over, having spent 20 years in the Senate, I was approached by folks in the telecom industry. They have a need for connectivity, particularly throughout rural California. They wish to place small cell phone towers, and they need lots of places to do it. Department of Finance identified a possibility of $20 to $40 million in revenue if we could work out the contract with them. So when I went to State Lands, they don't have even the tech staff. Most of their maps are still sitting in plats in drawers. Interestingly, the Marine Corps has a bunch of business with them, having to mainly do down with the desert, but they have the technical capacity to bring them to GIS status and have it all online and have everybody able to look at where the school lands and everything are, which would then give us the opportunity to do those leases with Verizon, with AT&T, et cetera, and generate some significant revenue. State Lands doesn't even have the personnel at this point in time to have somebody to take those maps and digitize them so that we can give them to the Marine Corps. The Marine Corps has actually offered to do this. It costs about $75,000 to put all of their leasehold, everything that State Lands owns, into a database. Marines have basically said, we have so much business with the state, both on renewable energy. They have some very, very valuable habitat down in the desert that they would like to swap for inholdings that we have at 29 Palms. And they're willing to actually pay for the GIS capabilities if we can do that first little step of getting this stuff. They don't believe that it is proper for a federal department to have actual physical control of the maps. So if we can do this one step, which would cost about half a PY, by getting that into a GIS database, we would open up the leases with the telecom industry. Wonderful opportunity to generate revenue, virtually no environmental impact. A lot of this, if you're familiar with our school lands program, they're very disparate holdings. They're an acre here, an acre there. They are very little value as they are. But if you put these little telecom towers on them, they have some value. Second place of great interest for a lot of the rural areas in California, particularly in the mountain areas, we've got huge problems of timber overgrown forests, our poor timber policies of the last, going all the way back to the 30s, where we have suppressed fires. So now our forests don't look like what our forests used to look like. We've got lots of small trees, too many trees per acre. A traditional California forest, if you went back to 1850, would be significantly less number of trees per acre, but a lot larger trees. The stuff at the bottom would burn out in the lightning strikes. In these rural communities, it's very important that we treat the land, as the proper term. Getting beyond all of the fights over the years between timber companies, environmentalists, etc., there is a way to treat these lands that would provide some jobs, would provide some fuel for waste to energy facilities, would protect our rural communities from massive fires. State lands has the opportunity to do that if we were able to get those school lands into a database where we would have a GIS where we could actually go out and do some of these leases. So the lack of technological capacity, and this is just one example of the things that are going on. The Marines are very frustrated. They would love to make these deals. They have some wonderful habitat. The Marine Corps has become a major wildlife agency, much to their chagrin. Would like to trade us the good habitat for some land that they have, that we have, that they would like. We can't get there. So just a couple of PYs would enable much of this. At the same time, I understand your problem. I mean, just handing over new PYs while you're cutting in other places is very, very difficult. We need a work plan. The controller asked even aside from the audit for a specific work plan. Look, they don't have proper staff, but going on this for 20 years, there's got to be, how do we get X amount of leases reviewed every month? How do we get insurance out there? How do we get bonding all up to date? These are things that need to be done. They need a workout plan. No business would be able to kind of go for 20 years. We haven't done this, and we need to get there. I think the staff is moving in that direction. I do. Tell you, it's somewhat an aside, which is very interesting. You talk about laws of unintended consequences. The commission is a three-member commission. You have state lands, controller, lieutenant governor, Department of Finance. I cannot speak to either of the other designees under Bagley-Keene because that would make up a majority. So for us to coordinate, we have to do it in public. I cannot talk to either of the other two to figure out what they're thinking, what directions we would want to give to staff. It's a fascinating little piece of state government. It never occurred to me until I got there. We like open meetings, but it makes it very difficult to come up with a policy. If you've got three masters, in many ways you have none. And that's somewhat where we are, and I think the agency has been somewhat adrift because of it for a long time.
Okay, thank you for your comments. Let me open this up at this point for any public comment. If there's anyone in the audience who would like to make a comment relative to the items at this hearing.
Hi. My name's Stephanie Bray. I'm with SCIU Local 1000. I just wasn't really planning on commenting, but I just wanted to bring a couple things to light. Just for your information, because they are not designated as a revenue-generating department, this agency faced furloughs, so all of these wonderful people who could bring money in, all were furloughed during the furlough period, who are now trying to use their furloughs. They are all, depending on their contracts, are all facing PLPs or personal leave days in their contracts, so they're all taking time off right now too in their contracts. So and I just found out that they just last week, I guess last week, just got under the hiring freeze. So they just stopped being under the hiring freeze. So now they can actually hire people. So, you talk about wanting them to fix things before they get people, but do you realize that just from their information, they have one position to do appraisals for 1,000 revenue-generating leases. So I don't know how you're going to get money for a department when they have one appraiser. So I think that really this department, you need to look at staffing because you need to continue to bring in money. This is money it's easy money. This is easy money. This is a place where you can actually bring money into the general fund where you don't have to tax anybody. You don't have to this is easy money, and we really could use this money in a nice way, this is a good place to bring it in, and these are really deserving positions. And you should also look at bringing in permanent positions, not limited term positions, because if you bring in limited term positions, then if you don't continue to fill them, you then have to go back and hire people again and again, and that takes a long time. It takes like a year to hire somebody, and then you lose all of that training. So, thank you.
Great, thank you very much. Anyone else in the audience who wishes to make a public comment? Seeing none, let me just wrap this up from my perspective, and that is that I think that this audit certainly has identified a series of issues that need to be addressed by the State Lands Commission. Addressing those issues will provide, I think, both a better management of our public lands and the opportunity for additional revenue for the state of California. Both, I think, are worthy goals, and I commend the Commission to try to achieve those goals. And the Budget Subcommittee number 3 will, as we meet next year to review the budget of the State Lands Commission, want to hear follow-up on these items, and should there be any budget change proposals, we'll have the discussion on those at that time. So I'm hopeful that the Commission will continue to make progress on addressing its management issues and working to guarantee that we're maximizing our revenue and guaranteeing good trust of our public lands. Mr. Jones, any final comments?
No, I'm good. Thank you.
Okay. With that, this hearing will be adjourned. Thank you all very much.